Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a new microphone. Ha 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 ha. And what better to start off a new microphone with another chapter of Solar Embrace? Yes, your long-awaited patience has been awarded you with another chapter. And this chapter is chapter 6. The truth will set you free. Oh boy. Indeed, the thunderstorm that ravaged the island did not run itself out until the very early hours of the morning. Celestia awoke to a thick fog enshrouding the forest, the eerie calm unsettling her slightly. It was as if she and Spike had traveled back in time, back before the galactic rule of the Alicorns, back to an age when primordial creatures lived and died under a much younger sun, uncaring of the galaxy-ruling scaly figures that watched over them. The Council of Dragons, and indeed the entire species, had conceded the throne of power after the extinction of their most favored creations by way of an asteroid, stating, "It is time for a new age." Or so the princess remembered from her Alicorn history lessons. The princess knew she had nothing to fear from the forest, since there weren't any dragon or dangerous animals or anything, but that didn't stop her from feeling a slight tremble go up her spine. The fog eerily reminded her of an amorphous blob, blanketing everything in sight. Her stomach grumbled slightly, an evident sign that she had had little to eat since arriving on the island. Celestia could only guess as to what Spike was feeling inside, as he hadn't made any notion of feeling better, save for the slight murmuring in his sleep, grabbing the empty bag that used to carry the Thornwall's bounty, which had been lost during the tumble in the river. She stooped over Spike. "Spike, if you can hear me, I'm going to look for some food. I won't be gone long, I promise." She didn't have anything to write on, so she couldn't just leave him a note or something similar. The dragon merely muttered, "Okay," or something along those lines. Celestial took it as a sign she could leave him alone, and so she set out, the cave's entrance disappearing behind her as she set out into the fog. The undergrowth also obscured it in a rather well in its dim setting, but she placed a mere tracking spell on her hooves as she went along. It was a terribly simple one, and effective. In her mind's eye, she could already see where her footprints would lead back to. A veritable trail of breadcrumbs. Look like out of a fable. Right away, she found some rather delicious-looking berries, and after consulting her brain, remembered them to be a species of wild cherry ideal for jams and jellies, but perfectly scrumptious when fresh. Plucking as many ripe ones as she could reach, and using tiny bursts of magic to reach ones on higher up, Celestia packed them away gently in her makeshift bag. She had already lined it with some of the grasses and sedges that grew along the banks of the river, after having carefully walked along the bank to collect them. Already she could feel her magic beginning to return to her in force, and her wings were starting to feel better as well. Having not been terribly exhausted by the river's warmth, the food she had managed to eat on a thorn wall was rejuvenating her in both body and magic. If only the surge of nutrients gained from that small meal could ease her conflicted mind like it did her body, then she'd be happier than that they were safe. You'll have to tell him, you know," a whisper said, causing the princess to nearly drop her goodies in astonishment. Looking round, she saw nothing but plants and thick fog. The sun had obviously risen already, as she could innately feel such things, but for the life of her she could not see where it was in the sky. The fog obscured anything farther than a few dozen feet, and the overhead trees did little to help with the situation. "Who are you? Show yourself," she said in a hushed shout, not wanting to scream for fear of Spike waking and losing himself in his quest to find her. Was the stress of the island finally getting to her? Was she starting to hear voices, a sure sign she was going completely cuckoo? Or had her feelings finally become so overwhelming that she could no longer hold them back, and was experiencing some sort of paranoid delusion? "I have always been here, Celestia. You know that as well as I do," the voice said, oddly familiar and entirely feminine. "Why won't you tell Spike the truth? You know dragons value and respect honesty, even if it isn't exactly what they would like to hear. How else could you have concluded that peace treaty between those two dragon nobles 700 years ago? What truth? Celestia asked, as she plucked a few leaves from some wild lettuce, still glancing around for the source of the conversation. How do you know about Spike? A dragon's code of honor was always unique to the individual, and Spike was perhaps one of the most unique dragons in the entire world. He had been raised by ponies, far from other dragons, and even farther still from the place where all of his kind had originated. Perhaps someday, far in the future, she would show him where that was. I know him because you know him, Celestia. You must tell him the truth of why you are here, my dear, the voice said, its volume barely above that of a whisper. The truth of why the world is in such danger, and of why you selected him specifically for the task, of why his friends are in trouble for your foolishness, and how he can help you through this difficult time. Celestia suppressed a growl as she leaned up and plucked 2 ripe mangoes from a small tree. He will know in time, as we near the date. It is better that way. She was beginning to recognize this voice, as it had a familiarity to it that even she could not deny. But why then? Why can he not know now? Before an ultimatum is the only way for him to agree. The princess looked around for the voice once more, but could not find the source. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, and the sheer lack of emotion in its words made her shiver slightly. It will be an easier decision for him to make when the urgency of the situation overrides any possible repulsion he may feel. Ah, repulsion, the voice said, an almost humored tone emanating from it. What would he have to be repulsed about? By how beautiful you are? By how selfless and passionate you are to creatures from all walks of life? By how I tricked him, Celestia said softly, as she walked around, picking leaves from several edible plants as she did so. I led him to believe there was a device or construct of some sort on the island that could aid us in saving the world. I never specifically said such a thing existed, but my words led him to believe such a falsehood nonetheless. I know. I was there when you said all of that, the voice whispered, sounding closer and closer with every spoken syllable. I have always been there for you, after all. We can never be separated, you and I. Who are you? Celestia's nerves were getting the better of her. She wanted to shout, to scream, to throw branches around to find this maddeningly calm and all-knowing voice. It took much for Celestia, Princess of the Sun, to lose her cool, but right now she felt like losing her cool would be an appropriate thing to do. How else would any other pony respond to hearing a voice that belongs to something that they cannot see, but also apparently knows them as well as they know themselves? They'd probably think they'd lost their minds and check into the loony bin or something. I am here, the voice said simply, and Celestia felt an urge to rub her temples. I am your conscience, Celestia. You and I have been good friends for many millennia, with very few things ever coming between us. I am, after all, the collected thoughts, experiences and feelings of you since the day you were born. All alicorns are born with a very secondary intellect, so as to help manage their many millennia lifespans. All those years of life and the resulting experiences can take a toll, even on one such as us. Since her conscience was technically part of her, and yet slightly separate, it could use the terms us and I in equal measure. But why now? Why on this island should you make yourself known once more? Celestia finally realized she was simply talking to herself, which meant this was all in her head, but that did not stop her from remembering when her consciousness had nearly taken a physical form just to talk with her about a painful decision. A decision that haunted her to this day, even more so than when she had accidentally wiped out all future chances of life evolving on the planet Mars. You and I have not had a good discussion since our sister Luna's transformation into the dreaded Nightmare Moon, the voice said again, softer in a tone and yet having not diminished in volume at all. We have not truly needed one, and so I have remained silent until now. Your deceit, however minor or important in your eyes, is eating you up on the inside. I can tell you are aching within, knowing you won't tell Spike until it is too late for him to make a decision. too late for him to try and refuse you. When the fate of the world is in your balance, he will submit, but forever hate you for this trickery. You and I both know how the loathed and hated by every pony, even your enemies. But what do I do? Celestia asked, sitting down and putting her face in her hands. She felt like she was in front of her parents again, as a little filly, asking why her cutie mark hadn't made itself known as soon as her cousins had. She was thousands of years old, and yet she was asking herself, her subconsciousness, for answers she had battled with for days on end. "Tell him the truth, Celestia," the voice said once more, sounding as though it was drawing further away with every word. Her conscience, even in all its collective wisdom, never lasted very long when it made itself apparent to her. It wasn't designed to lead her all the way through life, but just to act as an occasional source of guidance and advice. Tell him the truth today, and see where it goes from there. There yet may be a way to salvage the upcoming apocalypse if you tell him everything. Celestia sat in silence, her head in her hands, and as she thought on the voice's words. Of course, any pony who knew she talked with her incredibly more mature subconscious, would think her completely crazy and petition for seek medical attention. However, she knew that the inner voice she had been talking with for the past few minutes was right. It was time Spike knew of what was going on, and what he would need to do to save his friends. Ugh, I feel so just terrible at this whole ordeal, the princess muttered to herself, both dreading the return of the cave and feeling relieved of no longer having to keep this secret from Spike until the very end. She would tell him, plain and simple. She would tell him upon returning to the cave what would need to be done, and maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't hate her for her falsehoods she had bestowed upon him. I want to tell him, right after I finish collecting some more food, the princess said, walking a bit further away from the river along the rock face that led towards the cave. Yes, this sugar cane will do nicely, I think. A while later, and back in the cave. Spike opened his eyes slowly and groaned, his entire face hurting as his muscles beneath moved. It was no longer swollen, but the flesh was still somewhat tender underneath his scales. Blinking a few times in the subdued light, he glanced out of the cave entrance, seeing a light fog bank obscuring anything more than a few dozen feet away. Rain must have stopped a while ago, he muttered, sitting up from the bed of mushrooms. The soft, spongy material beneath him had to have been rather thick to have supported his weight, and yet it did without any apparent effort. Didn't expect that, he muttered, as he looked down to the soft bed-like area he had slept on. Glancing over, he saw another slight indent right next to the one he had apparently made. "Celestia slept next to me again," he whispered to himself, curious as to why he was actually a bit happy that had happened. Then, in a slow but definite rush, it all started coming back to him. The day before floated before his eyes, slowing down at moments that seemed more important than others. The last thing he saw, and now remembered, was Celestia's soft voice, puckering lips, gently pressing against his own. Even now, many hours later, the mere memory of the event sent a strong tremor up his spine. "Celestia kissed me," he muttered, wanting to both shout it to the world and hide away from everything. Of all the things that could have happened to him on that island, by far, that was the fourth or fifth least likely thing that had thought what could happen. He had been kissed by the most powerful being in all of Equestria. It hadn't been some lightly on the cheek, meaningless sign of affection either. It had been full on the lips, with something far more meaningful than the gratitude hidden behind it. Spike felt so embarrassed by the encounter, and yet that little action brought a thought to his mind. Unheeded, unwanted, but still it presented itself before him. Just why this island? Celestia had mentioned something being here that could help save the world from the sun's upcoming problem. But what exactly? What would it need to be an unknown island in the middle of nowhere, with no animals save for some little birds and pollinating insects? There were no buildings, no signs of civilization, no resources save for whatever food they could scrounge up, and in addition no real way off the island. Perhaps the most perplexing of all was not why the island itself, but why did she choose him? He was a dragon, sure, and dragons were known for being able to do things even gifted unicorns would find impossible, but why? Did he have something she needed specifically? Was there some sort of ritual where he'd have to do something? If there was, what would it be? Would it be bad? Spike, a voice said, snapping the dragon out of his thoughts. Looking up, he saw Celestia come into view of the cave, the bag she had made from the dress's sleeves, nearly falling, or filled to bursting. I see you're awake. Good. I need to tell you something. What's in the bag? Spike asked groggily, rubbing his eyes as the princess laid out the harvest. Some cherries, wintergreen leaves, sugarcane, some wild rice, sedge, a few wild leeks. Celestia rattled off, playing out each type of food in its own little pile. I'd say we have enough food here to last a week, unless we strain ourselves. That is. Yeah, about that. The dragon said, turning to face Celestia. I've been meaning to ask you something. I didn't want to say it first, but it's been bugging me like crazy, and I really want an answer. Celestia paused for a few seconds, her face impassive. Go ahead, Spike, she finally asked. Ask away. Well, why are we here, on this island? Spike asked, watching Celestia's face carefully without looking like a total creeper doing so. It is completely isolated, there's no real wildlife to speak of, and as you said before, no pony in the world knows it even exists. At first, this led me to believe that it was just hidden away until it needed to save the world, but I doubt that is true. Well, the reason we are on the island are precisely the same as what you just said, Celestia replied. Isolated, uninhabited, and far removed from the minds of the world. It is ideal. That is my second question. Ideal for what? Spike asked, crossing his arms. He did so not in anger or some sort other similar emotion, but as relaxing gesture while slinking. You said this island would help save the world, but far from what I've seen, neither you nor any pony else has been on this island in forever. The time it takes to get out here, coupled with the way it is naturally built, leads me to believe that there are no structures here of any kind. The island is ideal for some pony to be alone from the rest of the world, Celestia responded. Your deductions, although very Twilight-like in manner, are correct as well. There is nothing on the island that can aid us, and the island itself is merely just that, an island. Spike inwardly blanched slightly at this. She was being awfully forced about this whole ordeal. Usually Celestia had some sort of grand vision or non-dubious scheme that would bring about a better future or result for every pony else, usually excluding herself from the fruits and said plan. But here, now, what was she getting at by being so forward? So then, why me? Spike asked, unsure of what else to ask. She had pretty much shot down every other question he had thought of by simply telling him the apparent truth of the first two. Celestia sat down and let her legs lay beside her, as if she were reclining on a royal sofa. Spike, you are the only one in all of Equestria to whom I could not only trust to complete this, but who would also do so selflessly and without want for some reward. Do what? The dragon asked. I am sure any pony there couldn't refuse a direct request from you, even if they wanted to. You are the Princess of the Sun, after all. Who would say no to any request of yours? That is just it, Spike, Celestia said softly, her tone sounding slightly sad. I could not ask for any other to do this, as I knew no pony would refuse. I cannot choose them, no matter how magically inclined or intelligent, no matter how strong or brave or selfless. Why? Because I knew they would not survive. They cannot survive what I would ultimately show them. I could not bear to have their death on my hands, even if it meant saving the world. Wait, survive? Spike asked, visibly blanching out at the word survive. Survive what? Spike, you have lived in Ponyville long enough to notice things change around certain times of the year, yes? The princess asked. Well, yeah, of course. The dragon mumbled, not sure where this conversation was veering off to. Leaves change colors in the fall, birds migrate before after winter, most flowers bloom in spring and early summer, you know, that stuff. I assume you have noticed how mares act during one special troublesome time of the year. Celestia knew each action did not go unnoticed around the young dragon. Ponyville did, after all, have a rather sizable population of mares, unlike some of the larger cities along the coast. Spike put two and two together, and upon realization of what she meant, he blushed, a bright crimson through his purple scales. Oh, yeah, the heat, they call it. Do Do you get it too? Yeah, Spike, all alicorns experience the same mating instinct as do Pegasi, zebras, unicorns, and earth ponies, the princess said, noticing how Spike's blush darkened slightly at the word mating. Alicorns, however, have very intense periods of heat, though they do not last long and occur every 1,000 years, so as to accommodate to our very extended biological cycle. Compared to a normal mare's several week-long cycle, an alicorns usually lasts for a few days, 4 or 5 at the most, with 3 being the average. So then, when was your last heat? Spike asked, his blush somewhat deepening even further at the word heat. Would he ever become used to talking with Celestia about something like this? Approximately 2.5 weeks short of 1,000 years ago, give or take a few days, Celestia said, calmly. Spike, on the other hand, looked anything but calm. So, need me to help with your heat? He asked, his blush fading slightly as a realization dawned on him. But what about the soul or whatever that's going to kill us all? What does that have to do with anything? Everything, Spike. It has to do with everything, the princess said, as her wings folded and unfolded behind her. I am tied to the sun, and as such it fluctuates as I do. When I experience my heat, it can cause the sun to fluctuate greatly in both the inner and outer layers. The last time my heat occurred at the same type of solar ejection, it erased all forms of life on Mars. It was all my fault, as this one will be as well, unless we do something about it. Wait, there was life on Mars and you killed it? Spike asked, confused as well as embarrassed. It had been easier to simply believe the princess had no hand in what was going on with the sun, but now, in light of this new evidence, he had no idea what to believe anymore. Yes, though that no longer matters, Celestia said softly, her will refusing to let her eyes shed one single tear. As I mentioned before, during our relatively brief reproductive bout, we become unstable in our earthly forms. I assume you have heard of where alicorns come from? Well, yeah, from the stars, the dragon said, uncrossing his arms and instead folding them into his lap. I thought those were all just myths and weird explanations for things ponies don't understand. No, Spike, they are all true. Alicorns do come from stars, and when the heat hits us in our early forms, we become very, very different from what we are now, the princess said, glancing out to the cave's entrance. Are you mad? Mad at me for not telling you this sooner, for not confiding in you before we were stranded on this island? Well, maybe. I don't know, Spike said, his eyes inadvertently being drawn to Celestia's body as the thought of her and her heat plagued his mind. You technically didn't lie to me, but you weren't entirely truthful, you know. Oh, this was so hard. He should be furious with her for not telling him outright, and yet he wasn't. How could he be, after all? He, along with the rest of Equestria's population, was subconsciously influenced by the majority's belief that Celestia always had their best interests at heart. So even in the light of the brief altering evidence, he was having a really hard time trying to figure out what exactly to do. Yes, I do, Celestia said, looking back up at the dragon with a sincerely sorry look in her eyes. Can you forgive me, for your princess, for not acting prudently when such an explanation would have been sufficient? I should have told you much sooner than this, but I was afraid of what might happen if you refused me. Well, I doubt I would have said no. Gosh, this is hard, Spike muttered to himself, pinching the bridge of his nose in frustration. Not at Celestia, no, but at himself. Just what was he supposed to do? Tell the princess the deal was off, or not help save the world? Act like a selfish moron and doom his friends to death? Yes, I can say I honestly forgive you. But you'll have to make it up to me, the dragon said finally. So how am I supposed to help you with your heat? Mate you or something? Celestia blushed slightly at his words. Well, Spike, that is the general idea, she said softly. She almost wanted to say something along the lines of, when a mare and a stallion love each other very much, blah, 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 but ultimately decided against it, too inappropriate at the time like this. Spike's blush returned slightly, but he seemed to be holding back pretty well in the princess's eyes. Well, okay, but what do we do? I'm not exactly sure of, that, Surely the princess had some sort of experience and knowledge on the subject, right? We will take it slow, as we will not technically need to mate for some 2.5 weeks, the princess said slowly. However, that does not mean we cannot learn more about each other. Spike was silent for a few moments, as his brain took time to process just what the princess was not only saying but implying as well. He would have to sate the princess's heat in order to save the world. To be perfectly honest, the idea of sex for the first time terrified him, as he didn't exactly have anything to go on from when came the act. He was woefully a virgin, probably even more so than he realized, and if he messed up, he'd likely be embarrassed about it for the rest of his life. Yet the more he thought of it, the more relaxed and intrigued he became about the whole idea. Celestia was an unobtainable prize to any stallion, and even if the sex with her wasn't the best, he'd still be held in such a high accord by stallions and mares alike for his dutiful service. Yet he'd likely have mares from all over throwing themselves at him. He wouldn't want to bed the stud of a dragon that was specifically chosen by Celestia to provide her with some personal time on a deserted island. Stallions would want to buy him drinks and curry favors with him, as this little rendezvous with Celestia would likely put him in the upper end of the political spectrum. He would have to mate to Rut, to breed Princess Celestia, co-ruler of Equestria and Princess of the Sun, so that the world, by the extension of his friends, would live, and he himself would advance within society without having to sell his soul to do so. He was rather okay with that. To be honest, okay, so where do we begin? This is all rather new to me. Celestia sat up, got to her knees, crawling over slowly to Spike. Well, back by the river, I did kiss you, she said slowly as she drew herself up by the dragon. It wasn't much of something at the time, but I would like to do it again. Spike in a normal situation would have likely tried to retreat in both confusion and fright. Now, though, knowing both what was at stake, and mostly why the princess had chosen him in the particular, he stayed put. Yes, I think that would be a good starting point, he said softly as Princess Celestia pressed her body gently against him, tenderly pulling her up so that her eyes were level with his. Spike gently puckered his lips. Celestia did the same, and gently pressed them against one another's. They closed their eyes and simply chose to revel in the feeling of being so close to one another. Celestia could not help but revel in the surprising softness of Spike's lips. Like most of his outer body, they too were comprised of scales, but the sheer smallness of them rendered them as flexible, and thus so soft, that of the skin of any pony. The latent heat that he gave off made them, in her mind, almost as smooth as silk, and though they were warm to the touch, it was a pleasant sort of warmth. His warm body, covered by her own, exuded not only heat, but an inner masculinity that even she had not been aware of when they had first lain together on the beach. Oh, it felt like it was weeks ago, when in the fact it had only been about 2 days, but she could still remember the feeling of his against her then, and then against last night. But now that she told him the truth, and he had accepted what he would need to do, she felt something different lying next to him, or on top of him, to be precise. His shirt, torn to shreds by the thorns, and then more by the rocks and boulders of the river, hid nothing from her. Celestia could feel his pectorals against her chest, not immensely large, since he did not partake in a sort of work that would develop chest muscles, but they were indeed broad and very firm. His hands holding herself close to him by grasping onto his shoulders. She could feel knotted muscles move ever so slightly underneath, just waiting to be used. The sides of his arms pressed against his own arms. As she held on for the kiss, could feel his enlarged biceps and triceps move underneath his scales, and his hands roamed over her back. Oh, those hands, large yet soft, timid yet confident. Their movement across her back sent pleasurable chills up and down her entire body. Since their bodies were flush with one another, she could feel his abdominal muscles move beneath her with every breath, and took through his nose. Each one was defined perfectly, not semi-obnoxiously bulging, but was one part of a series of muscles. The long, sinewy cords felt rigid. Even under his scales, his waist, nowhere near as slender as hers, but by no means large, felt strong and limber, as if it were used in carrying around great weight all day long. Oh, who did she think she was fooling? It helped hold up his strapping, utterly attractive masculinity all day long. In Spike's mind, he felt like he was on fire in both body and mind. This was a curious thought, seeing as how dragons technically were burning within and were basically immune to fire, but to him a metaphor stood true. Celestia's lips were soft, softer than he remembered when the day before, and their silken touch sent unhidden tremors up his spine. The softness of her pelt around her lips did little to help those feelings, as small hairs tickled the edges of his lips slightly. He could feel her soft hands pulling her body closer to him, the weight settling onto his body with a surprisingly comfortable sensation, her hips pressed against his own, the large but not fat muscles feeling utterly feminine and attractive to him, her waist slender and yet toned somehow, pressed against his own, the dress doing little to hide the fact that she had toned abdomen, and to boot. But perhaps the most evident part of her femininity, or the two most evident parts, was pressed up against his chest. Her great globes, round and soft and all sorts of good, felt utterly foreign against his chest, but at the same time so utterly fantastic. Her nipples pressed through the fabric and their tattered dress, as his shredded shirt rubbing gently against her pectorals as they moved with the kiss. He could feel his body wanting to react to such a touch, but for the sake of his sanity he held it back, though just barely. After what seemed like an eternity, the two broke apart, their eyes opening as their lips parted ways. "Well," was all Spike could say, his heart and his cheeks threatening to consume him. "Yeah," Celestia replied out of a breath, even though both of she and Spike had been breathing through their noses the entire time. "Again?" "Yeah," Spike said, immediately, pulling Celestia more firmly into him, and their lips reconnected, a bit more passionate this time, their hands pulling one another closer. The two pressed more firmly into one another, continuing to revel in the other's presence. Spike's forked tongue slipped past Celestia's lips and started to intertwine with her own. Though the princess soon responded in kind, her tongue pulling on his own as if to draw him in further. As the kisses deepened, their embraces tightened as well, pushing their already tightly compressed bodies against one another. Spike, even amidst all of this much-wanted physical contact, felt the urge to remove his tattered shirt. It didn't mean anything to him anymore, and it was so tattered it made no difference to him. He gently pushed Celestia away from him, their lips losing contact with one another. Celestia panicked slightly after Spike had pushed her away. Was she kissing him wrong? Was she having second thoughts about forgiving her? Was he... He started tearing his shirt off, completely revealing his sculpted torso to the princess. Celestia's embarrassment immediately turned to intrigue and giddiness. As soon as the last shreds of the useless shirt were gone from Spike, she half-tackled him, pulling him as close to her as she could as their lips met against in a churning of passion and desire. Celestia knew her body's response to Spike's body, and as such her own mind's response was not some overly complicated notion of courtly affection or political maneuvering. It was the reaction when a pony had found the one they wished to breed with. Her alicorn mating instincts, though long overdue for a test drive, were starting to make themselves known to her. Her inhibitions were less guarded, her mind becoming more observant of the dragon's physical presence. The daydreams she began experiencing of Spike coming upon her having his way with... "Oh," she moaned into Spike's mouth. As their tongues continued to wrestle with one another, their saliva exchanging once more, breaking apart after a few minutes. She settled herself on Spike's chest, her hands propping up her head, her mane falling elegantly past her shoulders and over their bodies. "Spike, while I do wish to continue, I need to ask you of two things," she said, her voice sounding dreamy even to her. She felt lighter than air after their kissing marathon and sincerely wanted to continue. Her wings were starting to feel the effects of Spike's roaming hands and would likely soon experience what she had overheard the Wonderbolt Captain Spitfire referred to as a wing boner. Yes, Spike said in reply, his own voice sounding spine-tingling husky. Oh, wow. He sounded so sexy in that tone. She would have to ask him to talk like that more often. Have you ever kissed another pony before? She needed to know, as that sure felt like some good lip-to-lip contact in her mind. It would have been downright funny, or sad, depending on how one saw it, if Spike had more experience with kissing than she, a many millennia old princess. Spike was silent for a few moments, as if his brain was trying to regain blood flow and redirect precious energy back into his thinking abilities. Well, no, not like this, the dragon said softly. I mean, I've been kissed on the cheek in return, that and some kind of affection, but this is something I've never experienced before. What about you? No, Spike, I too have never the pleasure of kissing some pony like this. Celestia responded, lightly tracing the outline between Spike's pectoral muscles with one gentle finger. She could feel his heartbeat through his muscles and scales when she reached the upper part of his rib cage. I've kissed knights and such on the head as a sign of my gratitude for an accomplishment mission, or to bestow my royal favor upon them, but I have never been so intimate with some pony before. I must say you're rather good at kissing, that is. Plus 10 points to Spike's ego. The Princess of the Sun brought he was a good kisser. Sure, she didn't have any experience to draw upon personally, but that didn't matter, right? Oh, you're not so bad yourself, Celestia, Spike said softly, cupping her chin and giving her a small tantalizing peck on the lower lip. So, want to continue? He felt like he could do this all day, and in a not-so-small part of his brain he really wanted to. I would love to, Spike, the princess said slowly, pressing the palms of her hands against her chest. I'm tensing a butt in there somewhere, the dragon said in a bit of disappointment tone. Oh well, maybe could continue learning about each other sometime later. They didn't have to worry about food for a while now, judging from how much the princess had brought back. But we ought to keep moving, the princess said, removing herself from Spike's personal space, even though her body protested such an action. We can't stay in this cave. There are much better places for us to stay. High up in that volcano, a secluded place with plenty of food, fresh water, and anything else we need. Plus, it is a bit cramped in here for what we must do later. Don't you think? Spike glanced around the cave, sighing as he did so. She did have a rather valid point. If they were going to do this, and if it was going to be anything like what he had heard about offhand from mares at the markets, they'd need quite a bit of room indeed. And this cave was far too small for such activities. I guess so, he said, rising to his feet as Celestia rose to her hooves. How long do you think it will take us to get to the secluded little alcove of yours? It's not exactly just an afternoon's walk from here, judging from how large the island truly is. That and the fact that was likely another obstacle somewhere out there for them to conquer made him think the journey would likely take even longer than he predicted. I'm not sure, but it can't take us more than 3 to 4 days, depending on the weather, the princess said, handing him the bag of food as he walked over to her. Do not worry, Spike. We will have plenty more opportunities to explore one another until the time is required for us to save the world. Right, yeah, about that, Spike said, as they exited the cave. By now the fog enshrouding the island had lifted entirely, and much of the dew had already been absorbed by the numerous plants. Can I ask you something about that? Yes, there will be no more secrets between us on this journey, Spike. Celestia said, I am sorry there were in the beginning, but now you shall know everything you wish to. Right. When you picked me up for this, did my dragon heritage have anything to do with the decision-making process? You did say regular ponies wouldn't be able to handle you when the heat hit in full force. Celestia looked him square in the eyes, but in somewhat of a sweet manner. Of course, Spike, the princess said, quickly giving him a small peck on the cheek before walking ahead. You were the only one I could select for this task, so to speak. Why exactly? Spike asked as he followed her all the way from the cave and out towards the end of the forest. It would not be far for them to go, but it would still likely take some sort of time to leave this thickly growing place behind. A very simple reason, my dear friend, Celestia said as they walked through the forest. Dragons simply cannot burn. Spike didn't know what to say to that. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have enjoyed this presentation. Author's note. Well, there you go. Spike knows what he has to do, but will his mind and body both be up to the challenge? Will he be able to handle the pressure? Will Celeste be able to handle him? Stay tuned and find out. I'd like to thank my proofreaders for mostly getting back to me in a short amount of time. I'm sorry sorry to say a few have dropped out due to complications with their lives, but that is okay. I understand we can't all live on this site. And I'd like to thank Mr. Afrox for submitting this wonderful musical piece they created after being inspired by this fanfic. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Have a wonderful day. Peace off.